You know her as the queen of the underworld, the pale figure on the dark throne beside the Lord of the Dead, half of every year spent in the land of shadows. And you have probably heard it called a love story. It was not. The older sources tell something colder and far more familiar, the story of a young girl who was taken against her will in a deal arranged between two powerful gods who never once thought to ask her what she wanted. So tonight you'll hear the real story of Hades and Persephone, the abduction the gods quietly arranged, the mother whose grief froze the whole world trying to undo it, and how a girl carried off into the dark became something that no one had expected. If these are the kinds of stories you want more of, take a moment to subscribe. It genuinely keeps this channel alive, and tell me in the comments which myth you want to hear next. Now, settle in. To understand the queen on the dark throne, we begin in a meadow where it was always spring, with a girl who had never known a single bad day. Her name in the beginning was not even Persephone. The old writers call her Kor, which simply means the maiden or the girl, because that is what she was, the bright young daughter of Demeter, the great goddess of the harvest and the growing earth. The two of them were almost never apart. Demeter was the power that made the wheat rise and the fruit swell and the whole world turn green, and her daughter was the joy at the center of all that abundance, a girl who had grown up in a kind of endless summer, surrounded by her mother's love and the flowers of an earth that never stopped blooming. She spent her days in the meadows with the daughters of the ocean for company, gathering blossoms, knowing nothing of grief or fear or the cold, because in her mother's world, those things did not really exist. She was, by every account, gentle and happy and completely safe. And that safety was exactly the problem, because far away, in a place she had never seen and never thought about, someone powerful had noticed her and decided that he wanted her for himself. The someone was Hades, the eldest brother of Zeus, the grim and solitary god who ruled the kingdom of the dead. He spent his existence in a sunless realm of shadow and silence, surrounded by the countless dead, and somewhere along the way his eye had fallen on the bright daughter of Demeter, and he had decided he would make her his wife. But Hades knew something that mattered. He knew that Demeter would never, ever agree to give up her daughter, that no mother who loved her child like that would hand her over to be carried down into the land of the dead. So Hades did not ask Demeter. He went over her head to the one god with the authority to overrule her, Zeus, the king of the gods, who happened also to be the girl's own father. And in the older tellings, this is the detail that turns the whole story cold. Zeus said yes, without telling Demeter, without asking the girl. Her own father quietly agreed to give his daughter to his brother, and the two of them arranged the whole thing between themselves, not as a marriage to be celebrated, but as a taking, to be done by force and by surprise, before the mother could ever find out in time to stop it. The trap was a flower. The old stories say that the earth, at Zeus's bidding, grew a single extraordinary bloom in the meadow where Persephone played, a narcissus more beautiful than any she had ever seen, planted there to draw her away from the others. And it worked. The girl wandered off toward it, reaching out to pick this one perfect flower, drifting a little apart from her friends, alone for just a moment in the open field. And in that moment, the ground itself tore open. The old writers describe it as a great wound in the earth, the soil splitting wide with a sound like thunder, and up out of that darkness came Hades, Lord of the Dead, driving a black chariot drawn by 4 black horses. Before Persephone could even understand what was happening, before she could run, he had seized her and pulled her up into the chariot and turned it back down into the chasm. She screamed. The stories are clear about that. She cried out for her father and for her mother as loudly as she could. But Zeus, who had arranged all of it, looked away and said nothing. And the earth closed over them as if it had never opened at all, swallowing the girl and the god and the sound of her crying, and leaving the bright meadow empty and silent in the sun. The chariot carried her down, far below the world of the living, past the cold river that divides the dead from everything else, into the vast gray kingdom that Hades ruled. For a girl who had grown up in a world of endless light and her mother's love, It must have been beyond anything she could comprehend. The dark stone halls, the silence, the countless drifting shades of the dead, and at the center of it all, the throne where she was now expected to sit, as the bride of a god she had never chosen, in a marriage arranged by men who had not asked. The old writers say she would not eat. Down in that kingdom of the dead, grieving and afraid, refusing the food and the comfort her captor offered, Persephone simply waited and wept and hoped that somewhere above someone was coming for her. And someone was. Because while the daughter sat silent in the dark far above, her mother had begun to realize that something was terribly wrong. Demeter heard the echo of her daughter's scream and could not find its source. She came back to the meadow and found the other girls, and no Persephone, no sign of where she had gone, no sign of what had taken her, just a closed and silent field where her daughter had been. And so began one of the most desperate searches in all the old stories. Demeter, the great goddess of the harvest, lit 2 torches from the fires of a volcano and set out across the entire world to look for her child. For 9 days and 9 nights, the old writers say, she wandered without rest, without eating, without sleeping, without washing the grief from her face, searching every land, asking everyone she met, finding nothing. No one would tell her what had happened. The gods who knew stayed silent, because the god who had arranged it was the king of the gods himself. And slowly, as the days of fruitless searching wore on, Demeter's grief began to curdle into something else. Because eventually she learned the truth, that her brother had taken her daughter and that her own husband, the girl's own father, had allowed it. And when the goddess who made the entire world grow understood that the other gods had conspired to steal her child and then lied to her face about it, her grief turned into a rage that would nearly end all life on earth. Demeter stopped doing the one thing that made her a goddess. She withdrew her power from the earth entirely. The wheat stopped growing. The fruit rotted on the branch, and the seeds lay dead in the cold ground and would not sprout. The fields that had fed humanity since the beginning turned brown and barren, and across the whole world for the first time, the harvest simply failed. The old stories say it was the first winter, not a season in those days, but a catastrophe, a dying of the entire living world because the goddess who kept it alive had stopped caring whether it lived. People began to starve. And as they starved, they stopped making offerings to the gods because they had nothing left to give, and that, in the end, was what finally forced the hand of Zeus. He could watch a mother grieve. He could watch humanity suffer. But he could not allow the mortals to die out completely because without them, there would be no one left to worship the gods at all. Demeter had found the one weapon that even the king of the gods could not ignore. She would let the whole world die before she gave up her daughter. And she made sure Zeus understood that she meant it. So Zeus gave in, or seemed to. He sent Hermes, the messenger of the gods, down into the underworld to bring Persephone back and to tell Hades that the girl had to be returned for the good of the whole world. And Hades, faced with a direct command from the king of the gods, agreed to let her go. But the Lord of the Dead was clever, and he was not willing to lose her completely. Before Persephone left his kingdom, he offered her something to eat, a few seeds from a pomegranate, the dark red fruit of the underworld. And whether she was simply hungry after her long refusal, or whether she was tricked into it, or whether, as some of the older versions hint, she chose to, Persephone ate them. Just a few seeds. And that was enough. Because there was an ancient and unbreakable rule that bound even the gods. Anyone who ate the food of the dead, even a single bite, belonged to the kingdom of the dead and could never fully leave it. With those few small seeds, Hades had made certain that no matter what Zeus commanded, Persephone could never simply go home and stay there. A part of her now belonged to him, and to the dark, forever. So a compromise was forced, the kind of compromise that satisfies no one. Because Persephone had eaten the seeds of the dead, she could not be returned to her mother completely. But because the world could not survive without Demeter's blessing, she could not be left in the underworld completely either. And so it was decided, by the gods, once again, without much say from the girl herself, that Persephone would be split between the two worlds. For part of every year, she would live below in the kingdom of the dead as the wife and queen of Hades. And for the rest of the year, she would return to the surface, to the light, and to her mother's arms. And that, the old stories tell us, is why we have the seasons. When Persephone is below, in the dark, Demeter grieves, and the world grieves with her, the leaves falling and the cold coming and the earth going barren until winter covers everything. And when Persephone climbs back up into the light, her mother's joy returns, and with it, the spring, the flowers opening, the wheat rising, the whole living world waking up again to greet the returning girl. Every spring you have ever seen is a mother getting her daughter back. And every winter is the same mother, losing her all over again. And here, at the very end, the old story does something unexpected, something that lifts it above a simple tale of a victim and her grief. Because Persephone did not stay the frightened girl in the dark forever. Over the long years of her seasons below, the maiden who had been dragged screaming into the underworld slowly became something else. She became its queen, and not in name only. In the myths that come after, Persephone rules the kingdom of the dead with a cold and absolute authority that even heroes learn to fear. When the living dare to descend into the underworld, it is often Persephone they must answer to. She decides who is shown mercy and who is not. The girl who was taken without any power at all grew into one of the most genuinely powerful figures in all of Greek myth. No longer the flower-gathering child of an endless summer, but a dark and dignified ruler who holds the fate of every soul in her hands. It does not undo what was done to her. The abduction was still an abduction, the grief was still real. But there is something fierce and almost defiant in it that a girl handed over to the dark as someone else's prize refused, in the end, to remain a prize, and made the kingdom of the dead her own. We have softened this story over the centuries, the way we soften so many of them. We call it a romance. We put Persephone on her throne and imagine she must have wanted to be there. But the older sources never let us forget how she arrived, taken by force, in a deal struck between her uncle and her father, while the god who could have stopped it looked the other way. It is, underneath everything, a story about power and who has it and who does not. A girl who had none was handed from one powerful man to another as if she were a thing to be owned. A mother who did have power used all of it and nearly killed the world to fight a decision that had been made over both their heads. And the girl in the middle of it survived the only way she could, not by being rescued in the end, but by slowly, over years in the dark, becoming powerful herself. Maybe that is why we have never been able to let her go. Persephone is the maiden and the queen, the victim and the ruler, spring and winter, the stolen girl and the woman no one dares to cross all at once. And every year, when the first warmth returns and the world begins to bloom again, some old part of the story is still saying the same quiet thing: she's back. For a little while, she's back. If this is the kind of story you want more of, subscribe and tell me in the comments which myth I should tell next. Sleep well.